They were inquisitive, trusting, and still malleable in their development. In the Third Reich, the National Socialists shamelessly exploited the naivety of the children.
Teachers told me that the Führer wanted the best for Germany.
Youngsters were manipulated. Human values no longer counted.
Suddenly, the call came to hate, to demand separation.
Nothing was the way it once was.
Never again do I want to experience the pain of saying goodbye to someone you know will be taken away the next day.
The horror was inconceivable.
What children experienced in those camps can never be wiped from their memories.
Children in the midst of falling bombs. In World War II, daily life had become a nightmare.
Bombs were exploding all the time.
The grown-ups clung to us and we hung on to them because everyone was terrified.
A childhood spent in chaos.
All they knew was that they had to function in this tiny segment, and they did function like clockwork.
Exploited for Hitler's insane plans, the Nazis sent child soldiers into battle.
Günther, there's one over there, get him out.
These children would never forget what they had seen at the front.
No one with any common sense would have thought this possible.
What was vaunted as heroism gave way to bloody reality.
I was paralyzed with fear. What if he pulls the trigger, I thought.
What they had experienced not only haunted soldiers, even after the war.
And then we were beaten. It was appalling.
The collapse became traumatic. Many soldiers would never forget the horror.
What did you do with the child? My God, what on earth happened to you out there?
For someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, the trauma is never over.
The evil Nazi regime had exploited and betrayed them. What has remained is the pain.
Naturally, it's incredibly hard for many of them to understand that it was all an illusion, to realize that they were lied to.
We're talking about the eternal child that cried out so loudly but was never heard because there was no time or place for that.
For the gruesome war of the adults, the youngest of all sacrificed their most precious possession.
When I had overcome my disgust, I turned over the first corpse. Doing something like that is totally alien to childhood.
In the war, you just weren't a child anymore.
Hamburg, June 1945. The Second World War is over and Germany lies in ruins. People are slowly learning to rebuild their lives. 20 years previously, the world had no idea what awaited it. In the late 1920s, during the Weimar Republic, a fierce power struggle raged in Germany. The economic crisis saw voters turning in particular to the two workers' parties, the Social Democrats and the Communists. At first, little Günter Lux had no idea of his parents' political convictions.
But I had been influenced so much that even as a small child, their communist ideals already had a decisive effect on me. My parents associated with leading communists in Hamburg, so I got to hear quite a lot.
Günter Lux was born in Hamburg in 1928. His upbringing was characterized entirely by communist values. Together with his elder brother, Günter grew up in the Red East of Hamburg. His parents were members of the Communist Party. Its Social Democrat rivals were dismissed as social fascists.
Their view was that when they had got rid of the whole rotten lot, the capitalists, the exploiters, we'd all be better off. But they had no idea of how things would continue after that. And later we saw what that led to.
Elisabeth Lux always played an active role. In the east of Hamburg, Günther and Hermann's mother was known as Red Lieschen. A convinced communist, she believed firmly in socialist values. When the Communist Party held its meetings, the Lux family was always present. For the children, that was simply the way things were. they were involved and followed the examples set by their parents.
I can remember us holding hands with our mother when we attended their demonstrations. The grown-ups shouted out, "Red Front," so the youngsters thought we'd shout as well. We had little paper flags with a hammer and sickle. We'd wave at them and bellow what we thought sounded like Red Front, but wasn't.
Born in Hamburg, since 1925, Ernst Thälmann had been chairman of the Communist Party. The children found his nickname, Teddy, confusing.
When Teddy came, we were disappointed because we had been expecting a big teddy bear. My mother didn't like him so much because his speeches went on and on. She always said that by the end she'd stopped listening, and his words were battle cries. But he was close to the people. He could speak Low German dialect, and he lived in Eilbeck, where we moved to later. His parents lived on the Warnsbecker Chaussee. That's why we knew him a bit more closely.
For a while, politics still remained of secondary importance to the children, so the exceptionally long speeches given by adults were of no interest to them.
The Communist Party meetings were held on the Moorweide or in the municipal park. As kids, we were only interested in the music, in the bands. We didn't understand the grown-up speeches. We found them incredibly boring. Sometimes, when our parents told us we had to accompany them, we'd start complaining. We had no idea what was being said. We were unhappy because the adults were usually so angry, cursing and shouting. And when the police turned up in their vans and jumped out, and the street battles began, we had trouble getting away with our mother.
Back then, Thälmann described the National Socialists as a peripheral phenomenon of the final phase in the development of capitalism. The communists' enemy was the social fascist.
For us children, the SA people were the worst of the worst. The police were evil and the social fascists were evil. But we had no idea what that meant. My brother's father was a typesetter with the Reichsbanner organization. He too wore uniform. And whenever he visited us, an argument always broke out between my father and Uncle Walter, as we called him. We kids hated that because we liked Uncle's social fascist. He always brought us something. We used to say, "Uncle Social Fascist, have you got something nice for us?" And he'd reply, "Of course, I always have." And that raised doubts in my mind. If the social fascists are all like Uncle Walter, I thought, they can't be evil. But if I said anything, my father would then tell me to be quiet. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he'd say. So then I had to shut up.
January the 30th, 1933 changed everything. After the Nazis seized power, the communists saw themselves confronted by an enemy they had underestimated and who was now their greatest threat.
Later, when the Nazis were in power and my uncle came to visit us, he told my father, "You were wrong to call us social fascists. The enemy is on the right."
The Nazi takeover was a disaster for the Lux family. The Communist Party was banned, and Hermann and Elisabeth had to be careful what they said and to whom. But Red Lieschen still offered resistance on a minor scale.
When she went into a shop and saw posters saying, "If you came in as a German, you have to use the Hitler greeting," then she always used to say, "Hein Dittmar." That made the shopkeeper laugh. He'd point at the sign when she came in. But you had to be careful because there were lots of people who would denounce you. Then you'd be picked up, as it was called.
Political arrests were now an everyday occurrence. But what exactly did it mean to say someone had been picked up? For a 5-year-old, that was hard to understand.
I asked the block leader what it meant. He told me that people were then taken to a concentration camp. I had no idea what that was. It's a place where unreliable, idle people are taught to do useful work, he said. If they mend their ways and are prepared to work again, they are released. There's nothing bad about it. Naturally, I believed what he told me. How should I have known any different?
Through their slogans, the Nazis recruited more members for the NSDAP. They were even successful with some comrades.
I only know, for example, that Knut, someone from St. Georg, whom we knew very well, came to my father wearing an SA uniform and said, "Hermann, come and join us. Look, we've been given free uniforms and boots. We too want socialism, but just for Germans." My father's response was evasive. "I'll think about it," he told Knut. He was afraid of being reported, so he fobbed him off. "Give me a bit of time," he said. "I'll think about it." We children liked Knut. He always brought us something. One day, when we were standing on the stairs, I said to him, "Uncle Knut, I think your uniform is great. I'd like to wear one like that. But what would be just fantastic is if you also had a Soviet star on your cap." "I don't think that would go down very well," he laughed. As a child, you see things differently.
It was such childlike views of the world and its values that the Nazis exploited. To them, a naive child was a future voter. And not only that, it had already become clear at the NSDAP's Nuremberg rally in September 1934 in which direction Hitler was steering his youth.
Nach Ihrem Befehl, mein Führer, steht hier eine Jugend, die keine Klasse und keine Kaste kennt. Darum wollen auch wir treu sein. Adolf Hitler, der Führer der deutschen Jugend, hat das Wort. Meine deutsche Jugend, wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst nicht verweichlicht wird, sondern dass es hart sein kann. Und ihr müsst euch in der Jugend dafür stehlen. Ihr müsst lernen, Entbehrungen auf euch zu nehmen, ohne jeweils zusammenzubrechen. Und wenn von uns nichts mehr übrig sein wird, dann werdet ihr die Fahne, die wir einst aus dem Nichts hochgezogen haben, in euren Fäusten halten müssen.
Wer die Jugend auf seiner Seite hat, hat die Zukunft.
Those who have the youth of the country on their side have the future in their pocket. The National Socialist state needed new blood, also in the form of soldiers. So it wanted to win over adults, who after all were the voters. But at the same time, it also had to win over the next generation, which in any case it could educate in this spirit right from the start. So it was only logical to address young people and get them on its side.
Hilke Lorenz, a journalist and author who lives in Stuttgart, has focused on the subject of childhood in war for many years.
The National Socialists cleverly geared their propaganda to the world of experience of children and adolescents. In normal times, children joined the Scouts or the Girl Guides. The Nazis offered the Hitler Youth Movement, which in many ways was similar to those two organizations. But it was fundamentally a building block in the great plan of binding children and adolescents to the National Socialist state.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
Conformity, obedience, uniforms. Young heads were manipulated by the Nazis, and successfully too.
There are numerous stories of children from communist or social democrat homes also being equally as wild about the uniforms. This led to conflicts within families, which the Nazis certainly didn't find inopportune. In this way, they were able to separate children from their parents.
Belonging is a crucial part of growing up. Günter Lux didn't want to be excluded either, and most of his school friends were already members of the Jungvolk, the young section of the Hitler Youth.
First of all, as a boy, I was fascinated by the uniform. My classmates, who were already in the Hitler Youth, were marching in rank and file. I said I couldn't join them because I didn't have a uniform. But the Hitler Youth even took boys without a uniform and then put them in the middle, flanked left and right by boys in uniform, whenever the Jungvolk marched. That, I was told, was possible. But first, I had to become a member. My father, however, wouldn't hear of it.
Hermann Lux had no intention of exposing his son to further indoctrination by the National Socialists. But there was little resistance within the country. The anti-Semitism decreed by the Nazis was soon visible throughout Germany. Hitler made the Jews the scapegoat for the tense economic situation, and his plan paid off. Hermann Jax was Jewish, his wife Ellie Christian. Ruth, their daughter, enjoyed a carefree childhood until everything suddenly changed.
My parents often took me out in a paddle boat, so you could say I grew up in nature. That was until 1932, when the first Nazis turned up during a camping holiday by the Baltic. A good friend of my father's was camping with us, and my father said he didn't want to get him into trouble. "So we won't be coming here again," he told us. That was my first encounter with National Socialism.
Ruth Winkelmann was born in September 1928 in the Jewish hospital in Berlin. Judaism played only a subordinate role in her childhood. But after the Nazis seized power, it became clear to Hermann and Ellie Jax that daily life for the family would change completely. When she was 6 years old, little Ruth started school. Her father had recognized the dangers early on and taken measures to protect his daughter.
When I started school in 1934, my father told me that, since I was half Jewish, it would be better for me to attend a Jewish school. He didn't want me to be teased and baited. That was something I knew.
Jews were baited at every opportunity. They were abused and ostracized, and most Germans allowed themselves to be swept along by the racial fanaticism of the Nazis. But why? That might have been hard for adults to comprehend. For children, it was simply impossible.
At that time, Jewish citizens were an integral part of society. Franz had a friend he'd known since their days playing in a sandpit. The two were now 10 and were thinking of going to secondary school together. But then suddenly, His friend was no longer allowed to be a friend. Yet we have to take a diversified approach to the influence that was being brought to bear. It didn't just come from what the Führer propagated. The parents also played along. So how strong were parents? How strong could they afford to be? How much of a safety net did the family need in order to survive? In view of the dangerous situation, saying the wrong thing could see a family sent to a work camp or concentration camp and perhaps killed.
On the streets, hatred ruled, and Hitler's henchmen didn't even stop at children. They were systematically ostracized. And they asked questions. Their parents owed them answers. But how were they to come up with any when they themselves could not comprehend what was happening?
Once a month, my mother used to take me for a stroll through town, and we would always go for a meal in a restaurant. We always got a warm welcome, amongst other things, because I was a child with exceptionally good table manners. The waiters liked that. One day, though, there was this sign up saying, "Jews not welcome." And that was the end of that. As you can imagine, we never went there again. But I missed it. Even though it was only once a month, it was such a highlight for us.
On November the 10th, 1938, for hours on end, the Nazis destroyed Jewish shops, set fire to synagogues, and terrorized innocent people at random.
I went to school in the Auguststraße in Berlin center. My father and my grandfather always drove me there. The morning after the Kristallnacht, as it became known, there were the first glass fragments in the streets. Shop windows had been smashed. Daubed on those still intact were words like Jewish pig. Sometimes there was a Star of David with a line through it. The further we drove into town, the worse it got. In the Gartenstraße, we saw an Orthodox Jew being beaten up by the SA or the SS. 3 men on one. I found that appalling. I was shaking as I sat between my father and my grandfather. It all affected me deeply.
Nevertheless, little Ruth still went to school that day. On that November the 10th, many people were still unaware of the extent of the pogroms.
I arrived at school, and at first, everything was totally normal. When I went in, we were taken straight to the hall. The school was then sealed off. Rubbish was placed in front of the entrance, so we couldn't get either in or out. That was very impressive. Then there were these rioting gangs going up and down the Auguststraße, banging on the doors and windows. That was really scary.
The children in the school on the Auguststraße were frightened. All the exits were sealed. The teachers discussed how they might get the girls out and keep them safe from the bully boys.
After thinking things through, the teachers and the headmaster decided to take us out through the attics, 2 at a time, with a small wait after each pair. We surfaced in the Tucholskystraße. It was very worrying. And we couldn't imagine that things would get worse. We always reckoned the situation would simmer down.
But the shock ran deep. Günter Lux kept trying to convince his father to let him join the Hitler Youth. In the meantime, his parents were divorced. Günter and his brother were living with their father and his new wife Lizzie. Hermann Lux remained steadfast.
My father said, "You're not joining the Hitler Youth. Times will get better soon, and then you can join the Red Young Storm." And I was happy with that. But on the other hand, I wanted to join the Hitler Youth because my friends were in it. So there I was, teetering between two ideologies. What my mother told me couldn't be wrong. But then again, I was hearing from my teacher that the Führer wanted the best for Germany. So you can imagine that as a young person, I had no idea which way to go.
Günter's parents wanted to protect their son from manipulation, but soon the Nazis took even that right from them.
2 days before war broke out, a Hitler Youth leader came to our home and insisted that my father register me with the Hitler Youth. Now he had absolutely no option. And on September the 1st, 1939, I went to the Hitler Youth Center and was given a helmet, an identity card, and everything else that was necessary. When I got home, Lizzie said, "Come in." They're broadcasting a speech by the Führer. He was railing against the Poles and then said, "Since 5:45, we have been firing back." I took that on board, but it wasn't important to me. I was in the Hitler Youth, and that was important. The war was something secondary. I was glad about it, though. What a pity I'm still small, I thought. I'd love to be a soldier and march into Poland with the others. I already had the Nazi ideology in my head.
That day a dream had come true for Günter Hermann. At last he belonged. But his mother found it hard to take. Her son had turned to the Nazis. However, he hadn't entirely forgotten the values of his upbringing.
Then, when I went home, she said, "Goodbye, my little red Hitler Youth son." I wondered what on earth she meant by that. After all, I wanted to become a young communist. But on the other hand, I also wanted to be in the Hitler Youth because my friends were all in it. It was such a toing and froing between ideologies that it sometimes kept me awake at night. Even when I was in the Hitler Youth and the others were all singing, "Our flag flutters us onwards," under my breath, I was singing, "Brothers, see the red flag." After all, I knew those songs as well. It really was to and fro.
Children were easy prey for the Nazis, who even managed to sow mistrust within families.
You must be careful, my mother told me, even with regard to your brother Hermann. He had already been indoctrinated somewhat by Nazi ideology. "It's strange," she said. "He's always so quiet. Don't let on what happens here. Don't tell anyone that the comrades come round for coffee." I asked her why they wore the Nazi party badge on their labels. "It's necessary," she said. "We have to deceive the Nazis. But don't say a word to anyone, not even your father."
Günter Lux was torn. Not only were his own convictions being tested, he also had to be careful what he said within his own family. His parents also had to weigh their every word. They had given up any hope of protecting their children from the Nazis.
Today we talk about children being largely at the mercy of peer groups, with parents in certain phases being almost unable to bring their influence to bear. The decisive phase of puberty involves detachment anyway. But if someone is also told, you can do that, you are somebody, in other words, if they have their manly virtues bolstered, then I can well imagine that parents in those days stood even less of a chance of combating this detachment than parents today. After all, in those days it was a deliberate detachment, an exploiting detachment from the childhood home.
Even though some adults in Germany offered resistance, in the case of children, the Nazis were almost always successful.
The social life of a child is always confined within narrow boundaries. That is why little children tend to be immune to a bogey which looms up and disseminates views that are totally perverse. The most receptive and probably most endangered age group is comprised of mature junior school pupils and, above all, those who are going out into the big wide world. They suddenly see values they have established for themselves confronted by some Überworld.
Andreas Krüger is a specialist in child and youth psychiatry in Hamburg. As a dream therapist, he knows the importance of establishing human values in childhood.
When a child has developed intellectual capabilities and a concept of the world which corresponds to human and humanistic ideals, and is then suddenly called upon to embrace hatred, separation, humiliation and debasement, coupled with what we call a narcissistic upgrading of his own person, that, I believe, basically corrupts everything that is of value in a human being.
Wherever you looked, in the late 30s, Nazi propaganda was visible all over Germany. There was virtually no escape from the inflammatory slogans and the glorification of war. Parents who had previously been able to protect their children from this now saw themselves confronted by the brutal reality of National Socialism. Their authority was shaken. What had once been taken for granted was no longer valid. From now on, the state dictated how things had to be.
Our teacher told us that the Jews were there to take our money. A picture was painted to make us think that with his Nordic features, a German was a better person. Everyone else was an Untermensch, a subhuman creature. I was close to believing that, but my mother kept telling me exactly the opposite. They are no different from you, she would say. They are just the same as we are. After that, I didn't believe everything our teachers and the Hitler Youth leaders told us.
Children were taught to marginalize, to hate everything that did not correspond to the defined dimensions. Only an Aryan person was a good person. All others were to be ostracized. Teachers are role models for children. In the eyes of a child, they are always right. Yet in Nazi Germany, teachers fed their pupils on inflammatory slogans and propaganda on a daily basis. Brotherly love and compassion had long since been erased from the curriculum.
Everything they had learned about human relations, about coexistence, was cast aside. Sadly, few people from the time are prepared to talk about their innermost thoughts. That is a pity, because we as therapists, and especially me as a child therapist, could learn a lot from them. What effect did this propaganda, this external world, have on their inner world? I think that for many people, the most damaging aspect of all is that the humanity they had internalized was now being questioned.
The Nazis not only manipulated their children, they also used them to manipulate adults. National Socialist leaders showed themselves in public with children and had themselves filmed and photographed with them. After all, someone who is nice to children can't be a bad person.
Such pictures are always taken with the idea in mind that children bring harmlessness to a situation. I'm not certain whether every child standing there knew who or what it was cheering, but it was the parents who took their offspring along, who sought contact and who became immersed in the atmosphere. The underlying reason, perhaps, was that going to see the Führer had something of an event character to it. It was staged as something the whole family had to experience, and the pictures were intended to show that such visits were an integral part of life. He belongs to all of us, we all belong to him, and we now have a common future.
As long as it suited their purposes, the Nazis stopped at nothing. At home in Hamburg, Günter Lux and his brother Hermann were expected to earn a few pennies to put towards the housekeeping. Twice a week, after school, Günter delivered goods on his bike for a pharmacy. One trip took him regularly to the Jewish hospital in the Jonsallee near the university.
The pharmacy employed me as an errand boy, and I used to take medicines round to the hospital. The doctors and nurses there were always so nice and friendly. One day, they all had a Star of David on their coats. I was horrified. I had no idea that they were all Jews. My teacher had always said that the Jews were public enemies, parasites, and so on, that they were bent solely on evil. But these nice doctors can't be like that, I thought. When I got back to the pharmacy, I had to weigh out tea upstairs. When I started crying, the pharmacist told me that he understood why I was so shaken and said I would not have to go there again.
What Günter Lux did not know at the time was that Jews in Germany were not only being ostracized and separated from the rest of society through the Yellow Star, Jewish citizens had to report daily to collecting points, like this one in Stuttgart. There they were registered, had their valuables confiscated, and were put on a train belonging to the Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, without knowing where they were going. In fact, they were being taken to the Nazis' work and extermination camps. By now, no one was safe from the despotism. Ruth's cousin Egon was just 17 when, on an autumn day in 1941, he said goodbye to his mother to report for a night shift. But Egon never arrived at his place of work.
It was an absolute nightmare. Above all, Egon was a lad you could rely on, someone who would never have done anything wrong. He was such an upright young chap.
Egon Jacks had gone 15 minutes early into a shop which had set opening times for Jews. The men in black coats were already waiting for him. Egon was deported to Riga and murdered by the Nazis. Contempt turned into ostracism. Ostracism was followed by deportation. Deportation ended in genocide. Hatred of an ethnic group turned into hatred of the individual. Those affected were tortured by the question of why, but they received no answer.
First, you begin to doubt yourself. This can be explained psychologically. A human being cannot cope with a feeling of powerlessness. Someone points a finger at him and he gets a star stuck on his coat. With most people, it was probably the case that in order to escape from this traumatic experience, this feeling of impotence, they blamed themselves. Feelings of shame and guilt went some way to compensate for this powerlessness. It appears to be my fault. There must be some truth in that. Then, although I have to accept my guilt and feel inferior, as a final consequence, there remains a scintilla of hope that, if I were different, the world would be in order again. And a human being needs this basic principle of order in humanity simply in order to survive.
Humanity had long since disappeared because the order was to show no mercy, and the Nazis complied. Irrespective of sex or age, Jews were deported, forced to work, or starved in a concentration camp or ghetto, tormented and killed. What children in particular had to experience is simply unimaginable.
The conditions were created deliberately to humiliate people, to convince them totally and utterly that they were subhuman. And no individual could ever withstand that kind of psychological bombardment. The experiences which impacted on children in particular in the camps cannot be handled mentally. Our psychobiology is not geared to coping with this kind of permanent stress. Fear generates stress. After all, you want to do something to escape from the source of your fear, but you can't. In the long run, the situation damages a person's self-image because it begins with a total breach of confidence. Human relationships become impossible. The community no longer has any value because the community has ostracized me, and in the worst possible case, it will kill me.
Days, weeks, and months passed, and still there was no end to the suffering in sight. For many children, the natural reaction of their own body was a big help.
When biology is clear that there is no way out for you, it's like a gentle transition into the hereafter. Something in your head goes click. A fuse blows, and dissociative processes dissolve the situation, which is no longer compatible with life. They create a gentle transition to the hereafter. Children who had resigned, who could no longer pull themselves together, even if they wanted to, and just cowered there, also suffered dissociative processes in the sense of biological mercy. There are survivors who simply have no recollections.
Ellie and Hermann Jacks suspected that terrible things were happening in the camps and wanted at all costs to protect their daughters Ruth and Esther. The children were regarded as half Jewish. The Jacks heard of something called an Aryanization application and went to see a civil servant.
Herr Papenfuss advised my parents to separate so that they could then submit an Aryanization application for us. It would only be accepted, he told them, if they split up. But the Nazis saw to that themselves and had the marriage dissolved. It was a very difficult time for me. I wasn't allowed to see my father anymore. But we used to arrange to meet once a fortnight at an uncle's.
In addition to all the fears and changes, children in the Third Reich also had to cope with the bombing raids.
What changed most of all for children through the bombing raids was that they saw that their parents were no longer in control of their own lives. Their parents were no longer the people who protected them, who were able to guarantee their safety. Children had to experience their parents' loss of control.
Memories of the bombing raids still haunt those children today.
Was ich am meisten erinnere, ist der Geruch.
What I remember most is the smell of rubble and things that had been charred. And I clearly remember hearing the words, "Down into the cellar," whenever an air raid began. In the cellar, we used to cling to one another, adults and children. Naturally, we were all terrified. Then someone would run up and see what damage had been caused. With some buildings, the entire facade was missing. You could see people's furniture. And everyone would be asking if there had been any casualties.
Monika Jetter was born in Berlin in 1940. Above all, she remembers the routine when the alarm sounded.
When we heard the all clear, we'd go upstairs to see what had happened. At first, the damage wasn't much, but then the air raids began to occur more and more often. You no longer felt safe. Even if you were able to return to your apartment, you were always on tenterhooks because you never knew when the next air raid was coming. I remember that fairly clearly.
As Allied bombing raids increased, the destruction in Germany's towns and cities rose dramatically. When the sirens began to wail, it was dangerous to be out on the street. People had to head at once to their nearest bunker. Günter Lux also remembers. In 1940, he was 12 years old.
The air raid sirens started sounding in 1940. That was when the first British aircraft appeared. There was a factory opposite our house, and it had installed sirens. It was a long, drawn-out sound with 3 intervals. When all hell broke loose, we kids thought it was great. Then we had to go down into the cellar. The block leader told us to switch off all our lights. There was a blackout. Cars had to have their headlamps covered with just a small slit open. Even bicycles couldn't show a light.
The air raid warnings soon became part of everyday life, and for many children were nothing more than a big adventure. Often they just didn't realize the threat to life and limb.
We didn't take it at all seriously. We didn't go down into the cellar. We stayed outside. It was great. The flak searchlights crisscrossing as they scanned the sky with their huge beams. The major cities, don't forget, were surrounded by flak and searchlight emplacements.
It was a game. The children waited tensely to see what would happen next in the sky. But Günter Lux watched the spectacle with mixed feelings.
When an aircraft was hit, my friends would give a big cheer. But I felt sympathy for the man who was sitting inside. And I thought about what would happen if a wing fell off. The searchlights illuminated everything, and once an aircraft was caught in the light of 2 of them, the aircraft was always doomed. So I was always happy to see parachutes open. I knew then that the crew would be safe. There were some children who said they ought to be shot. But I thought that was awful. I couldn't say so, however. I was glad to see the parachutes disappear out of the beam of light in one piece and know that the man would land safely somewhere.
Few children even realized that human lives were at stake. A hit just meant one wrecked aircraft more on their adventure playground.
The next day we'd set out and collect shell fragments and swap them with one another. If one fragment had a guide ring, it was worth 5 others. And if you found a light metal bomb fragment, you could get 10 other bits of debris for it. But the exchange value soon sank. Then we stopped collecting altogether.
Da haben wir das nicht mehr gemacht.
And it would all get a lot worse. The war was by no means over. They were inquisitive, trusting, and still malleable in their development. In the Third Reich, the National Socialists shamelessly exploited the naivety of its children.
Teachers told me that the Führer wanted the best for Germany.
Youngsters were manipulated. Human values no longer counted.
Suddenly, the call came to hate, to demand separation.
Nothing was the way it once was.
Never again do I want to experience the pain of saying goodbye to someone you know will be taken away the next day.
The horror was inconceivable.
What children experienced in those camps can never be wiped from their memories.
Children in the midst of falling bombs. In World War II, daily life had become a nightmare.
Bombs were exploding all the time.
The grown-ups clung to us and we hung on to them because everyone was terrified.
A childhood spent in chaos.
All they knew was that they had to function in this tiny segment, and they did function like clockwork.
Exploited for Hitler's insane plans, the Nazis sent child soldiers into battle.
Günther, there's one over there. Get him out.
These children would never forget what they had seen at the front.
No one with any common sense would have thought this possible.
What was vaunted as heroism gave way to bloody reality.
I was paralyzed with fear. What if he pulls the trigger, I thought.
What they had experienced not only haunted soldiers, even after the war.
And then we were beaten. It was appalling.
The collapse became traumatic. Many soldiers would never forget the horror.
What did you do with the child? My God, what on earth happened to you out there?
For someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, the trauma is never over.
The evil Nazi regime had exploited and betrayed them. What has remained is the pain.
Naturally, it's incredibly hard for many of them to understand that it was all an illusion, to realize that they were lied to.
We're talking about the eternal child that cried out so loudly but was never heard because there was no time or place for that.
For the gruesome war of the adults, the youngest of all sacrificed their most precious possession.
When I had overcome my disgust, I turned over the first corpse. Doing something like that is totally alien to childhood.
In the war, you just weren't a child anymore.
In the early 1940s, Allied bombing raids on German cities increased. The Second World War left Germany in ruins. Children grew up with the familiar sound of air raid sirens in their ears. Everyday life was dominated by suffering and horror, death and despair, and there was no end in sight.
The first thing you learnt was that you had to be strong and function, that it was your responsibility to make sure the house was standing, that fires were put out. Sometimes we had to remove the dead from the streets. Terrible scenes, no matter how old you were. But they were part of everyday life.
To protect children from such sights and from the permanent stress of bombing raids, many youngsters were sent into the countryside, where life was safer.
The greater the scale of urban destruction, the greater the threat to the people, to children. So the state, in its self-proclaimed benevolence, launched its children's evacuation program. But many parents did not want their offspring to be taken away from them and become incorporated even more into the National Socialist state. But resistance proved fruitless. Having said goodbye to their fathers, youngsters were now being deprived of their mothers as well. There was no one close to protect them. To all intents and purposes, those who were evacuated had become orphans.
Parting was painful. But for many children, this was also an adventure, and, above all, a welcome change from the sad daily routine of life in wartime. Their most popular destinations included Styria, Salzburg, Pomerania, and the Bavarian Eastern March.
Coburg Fortress looked really impressive. It was all so new to us. We were put up in a Hitler Youth home. Hitler Youth leaders from Coburg were put in charge of our group. We played field games for the first time. We had never done that here in Hamburg.
Günter Lux grew up in Hamburg in a communist family. Nevertheless, he wanted to join the Hitler Youth. When war broke out, his father could no longer prevent it. Registration was compulsory. Together with his older brother Hermann, in 1941, Günter Lux was relocated to Coburg. But when Hermann was sent home and he was supposed to stay behind in Coburg on his own, Günter hatched a plan.
Any bedwetters were sent home. And because of the traumatic experiences, there were a few of them. So I thought I'd do that too. I wet the bed on purpose. I was embarrassed, but I did it 3 or 4 times in a row. So they decided to send me home and put me on the same transport as my brother. As we talked, he asked me how I had become a bedwetter. So I told him everything. And he laughed and said I was a crafty old so-and-so. All I said was I wanted to go home with you. And I would have managed it too, because here I wasn't a bedwetter anymore.
Back at home, everyday life in the ruins continued. By now, the major cities in particular, Hamburg, Kassel, Frankfurt, Düsseldorf, Cologne and Nuremberg, were regular targets for the Allies' bombers. After devastating raids in which thousands of bombs were dropped, in 1942 the war in the air seemed to have reached its height, but the carnage still wasn't over. Ruth Winkelmann experienced the war in the capital. As the daughter of a Jew, the bombs were not her only worry. Her parents separated in order to apply for Aryanization for Ruth and her sister Esther, but without success. Before the war, they used to meet regularly with relatives, but forced labor, the bombing raids, and the fear of deportation had changed everything.
From the moment we lived alone, we on our own and Daddy on his own, there was hardly any time for family life. We did meet, but basically we had little time together. After all, from 1942 on, I had to work. 12-hour shifts daily. A week on the night shift followed by a week on the day shift, so that left hardly any time.
Then came the shock. Ruth's grandparents were to be deported. The family hadn't met for a long time. They believed better days would come and they'd be able to make up for lost time.
But an aunt of mine, my mother's youngest sister, was very close to my grandfather. She used to visit him every week and take my grandparents something. And she also knew that they were going to be arrested. So we all paid them a quick visit. Everyone was in tears. It was terrible. I never again want to experience the pain of saying goodbye to someone you know will be taken away the next day or the day after.
For 14-year-old Ruth and her family, nothing would ever be the same again. The Nazis continued to keep the world on tenterhooks. Ruth's grandparents were sent to Theresienstadt, and things would soon get even worse. In February 1943, Hermann Jax went to work as usual. But he never returned home.
My father's youngest brother came to us and said they'd arrested Daddy. A whole world collapsed. Suddenly Daddy was gone. But I must say that in 1943 we were so preoccupied with ourselves that, although we found it terrible, each of us first focused on his or herself, and only then on the others. After all, the bombs were also taking our lives. I wept for my father, of course I did. But there was nothing much we could do about it.
It was wartime, and there was no room for grief. The children had to lend a hand. They had to be strong, hide their fear, and cope with the everyday reality of war.
Children rose above themselves and assumed tasks beyond their years. To survive in wartime, you always have to function and comply with instructions from adults. That makes you a mini-adult. But you can't necessarily assess the drama of a situation. All you know is that you have to function in this little segment. And youngsters did function, like clockwork.
For the youngest of all, the sound of an air raid siren, their mothers racing to safety, and the impact of the bombs had long since become routine. For Monika Jetter too.
Basically, I was always a very happy, cheerful and confident child. So sometimes I'd think, there's plenty going on down below, lots of people and so on. I don't think I realized about the dangers of being in the cellar. But you just had to make the best of the situation. What else could you do? You had to go down. There were these iron doors that were bolted shut. You sat behind them and waited till it was all over.
There was also a positive aspect to the fact that the bombs had already become routine for youngsters.
Basically, I would say that the smaller a child is, the more fragile it is. Sometimes the lack of intellectual and linguistic development can be protective. When I'm 11 months old and can barely say "mama," I don't understand what my parents and grandparents are saying about the situation and how dangerous it is. I'm experiencing the dangerous nature of the situation, but everyone is there. All the people who have always protected me are present. They are all running around, and there are lots of loud noises. But I'm on my mother's arm.
But child and youth therapist Dr. Andreas Krüger knows that in many cases it takes only a second, and suddenly nothing will ever be the same again.
The infant experiences sitting in the bunker with its mother and being breastfed. Then a bomb hits. Everybody screams. And suddenly the supply of milk from its mother stops. The infant turns into a crybaby and becomes more strenuous in this insane war. It develops post-traumatic stress syndrome. The noise, the commotion, and the mother's inability to reassure her child because of her fear all result in the child developing PTSD.
The experiences children made in the war varied. What they all had in common were permanent stress and constant fear.
I only knew that it was all about survival. Where can we get something to eat? Are we still safe in our apartment? The cellars were often broken into. Some people said my father had already come back. Others received the famous letter, "Fallen for the fatherland."
Werner, Monika's father, had been at the front since 1939. He had volunteered for military service.
It was a great opportunity for him. He was an illegitimate child in Berlin after the First World War. At the time, that was an absolute disaster. He wanted to study. He could have started an apprenticeship as a tradesman, but that's not what he wanted. He sought out the Nazis in the belief that it would enable him to make something of his life.
Born in 1940, Monika Jetter experienced the Second World War with her mother and elder sister in Berlin. She didn't meet her father until after the war. She only knows what he was like before then from what her mother told her.
When he and my mother first met, he must have been a really dashing young man. She fell in love with him and couldn't wait to get married. She was a strict Catholic, but he was Protestant, so he had to convert. They had a big 3-day country wedding in Upper Silesia, even though at the time he was already a Junker. But he did it out of love for my mother.
He wanted to really make something of his life, and the Nazis offered Monika's father this opportunity at the Ordensburg, an elite academy of the NSDAP. But as a candidate for the party's leadership cadre, he and his wife were expected to turn their backs on religion.
She told him he had to decide. It's either me or the Führer, she said. So he left the Ordensburg and volunteered for an airborne unit. He became a paratrooper. He did not renounce the Führer, of course, but he did break off his training at the Ordensburg because my mother was against it.
In 1943, the war finally became part of life in the capital. For Elly Jaques, everyday life became a challenge. Her Jewish husband had been deported. Her daughters, Ruth and Esther, lived in constant fear. A mere trifle could trigger off a disaster.
My mother had to collect our ration cards from the card center. Because my father had been picked up, she was especially afraid for my sister and me. While she was collecting the ration cards, we were supposed to go to Aunt Greta, her eldest sister. She was a civil servant and was thus not permitted to have Jewish guests. So I had to remove the star I was wearing. At the ration card center, SS soldiers told my mother they needed to see her children before any cards could be issued. My mother and the men then all came by car to pick us up. But we weren't given any ration cards. Instead, we were arrested.
The family was taken to the collection point in the Große Hamburger Straße. Together with many other frightened people, Elly, Ruth and little Eddie waited for further instructions.
Then a young man in uniform, probably SS, came down the steps and hit my sister in the head with his rifle butt. Just imagine, a 6-year-old child. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there. She clenched her teeth and looked him up and down. It was a terrible experience. There was nothing we could do. Then an official turned up and asked Mummy why she was there. She said she was the mother of the 2 children. He wanted to know about her bloodline. She told him she was Aryan and that her children were half Jewish.
It was a lie. According to the Nazis' race laws, the children were considered legally to be Jews, so it was compulsory for them to wear the Star of David. And in the event of a deportation order, they would not be spared. But half-Jews, as they were known, were not forced to wear the star and were further down the killers' list. Elly Jaques risked everything and saved her children.
Since I was not wearing the star on my coat, that saved me. I was really scared.
This fear, fear for your own life and fear for those you love, ran deep. Often, survivors just couldn't get rid of the feeling. It changed children, some of them forever.
Experts describe a situation in which a person's life is threatened, from which there is no escape, when a feeling of powerlessness arises that exceeds anything they have ever known before, as traumatic impotence. This constellation can affect anyone, old or young, infant or grandparent. Irrespective of age, the experience can trigger something in the brain which we call post-traumatic stress disorder. It is the symptomatic, primordial soup, so to speak, which can cause highly complex damage.
Nazi terror was palpable in Hamburg too. The regime never mentioned that countless soldiers were dying at the front every day. It continued to glorify the war. Further recruits were trained, and in September 1942, there was nothing Hermann Lux could do to prevent being conscripted. Günther's father was called up and sent to the front. His sons, 14-year-old Günther and 15-year-old Hermann, went to live with their mother, stepfather Helmut, and two half-sisters. It was a return to a household that was still firmly communist, but everyday life in wartime played a leading role.
Political views took a back seat. The bombing raids were heavy, and so the fight for survival took over. Political activities were almost non-existent. My mother put up personal resistance merely on a minor scale. For instance, defying custom, she refused to hang out flags to mark the Führer's birthday. Every second household displayed a swastika. But she just hung a small piece of bedding out of the window. The block leader was furious. My mother said, "What am I supposed to do? My little ones have wet the bed, and I have to dry the bedding. Have you got any other suggestion?" "Typical scum," was his reply. The next day, when the Führer's birthday was over, the piece of bedding was dry. That was the kind of mini-resistance she offered. But you had to be very careful.
In their new home, brothers Günther and Hermann experienced a totally different aspect of the war. Stepfather Helmut Kruschak continued to maintain contact with his old comrades. It kept him informed of things which government propaganda kept secret. There were, of course, the Volksempfänger, the people's wirelesses, which broadcast official propaganda. But we were given a large radio set, and my stepfather used to listen to the news from London. I listened too. We'd pull the blanket over our heads because we had to be careful. We might have been arrested. So the woolen blanket was pulled over our heads, and we'd tune in. This is Radio London. We heard news that made our hair stand on end. Things we'd never had heard from the official stations. They would broadcast reports like 36 British aircraft were destroyed in aerial combat over the Channel, with the loss of 2 of our own planes. But in reality, it was exactly the other way round. It was too cramped in the small apartment for 6 people. With every bomb that fell on Hamburg, fear grew, and with it the danger that after the all clear in the air raid bunker, like many others, they would be homeless. And yet in the summer of 1943, everything changed for the Lux brothers. Their stepfather, Helmut Kruschak, was transferred to the Czech Protectorate to build aircraft. Elisabeth and the small children went with him. Günther and Hermann remained alone in their apartment in Hammerbrook.
Aunt Olga, who had a greengrocer's in the same street, had to become our legal guardian and ensure that we were fed. But we lived alone in the apartment.
On the 24th and 25th of July 1943, Hamburg was bombed by the Allies. 791 British aircraft dropped over 2,000 tons of incendiaries and explosives on the Hanseatic city. In the afternoon, American bombers attacked.
The first two air raids were devastating, but it was mainly the port area, Altona, which got hit. We were in the cellar, under our house. The next bunker was much too far away, and we didn't feel like running over to it. We always trusted that nothing worse would happen. The next day, I was roaming around Hamburg a bit and found a leaflet about the size of a postcard. On it was written, "That was just the beginning. Other air raids will follow. Leave the city to avoid further unnecessary casualties. The Royal Air Force." I quickly threw it in a waste bin. After all, I had been told that passing on information like that was tantamount to spreading enemy propaganda, and that carried the death penalty. I don't know if that was true, but I was scared, of course. When I told my brother, he said, "That really is enemy propaganda. The British suffered such heavy losses the first time, they won't come back." If only he had been right.
It was the night of July the 28th, 1943.
We always left the radio on low. One day, Hermann woke me up and said, "Get up, Günther. There's a report coming through. A large force of enemy aircraft, they say, is on its way to northwest Germany." We had often heard that before. And it had often been the case that the aircraft had flown on to Berlin or Hanover. But this time, they were heading for us once again.
739 bombers targeted the districts east of Hamburg city centre, Rothenburg's Ort, Burgfelder and Hammerbrook, where Günther and Hermann Lux also lived.
Shortly after the sirens began to wail, the flak units opened up. Then the bombs started to fall. We dashed into the air raid shelter in our cellar. We waited and stared at the ceiling. Outside, all hell was let loose. It was terrible. In the cellar, there were several women and children, and 6 or 7 elderly men. One of them suffered a heart attack, and one woman screamed hysterically, "Help! Stop it!" It was horrific.
Bombs fell incessantly on Hamburg's residential areas. In next to no time, the buildings in Hammerbrook were ablaze.
The house in our backyard suddenly collapsed. It had probably been hit by a large bomb. Then there was this loud bang up above, and someone said, "That hit us." We ran up 4 or 5 floors to the attic and found everything was on fire. An incendiary had struck the skylight. There was no way we would extinguish anything, so we ran back down. I tore off my gas mask because something was burning my neck. I passed out. My brother carried me down, and we waited in some small space. I opened the door and saw how people were running past. One man doubled up and immediately burned to death. I went out, but the hot air from the firestorm hurled me back. Incendiaries were lying in the streets. Then Hermann had this crazy idea and said he had to go out and check on Aunt Olga. She lived only a few houses away. Wait, I said. I'm coming with you. No, stay here. She'll have to save herself. But he went out and never returned.
Frantic, Günther waited for his brother. There was chaos all around. The heat from the flames, the sound of exploding bombs, falling rubble. No one could feel safe in their apartment anymore.
After a while, I told myself that I had to get out. The building next to ours had collapsed. And in our house, too, bits of rubble, the banisters and things, were also falling down. I just had to get out. An old lady was staggering along the street, totally disoriented. I pulled her down with me to grab some air in the cracks between the cobblestones. When the firestorm ebbed a little, we got back to our feet and ran some more until we reached the Norderstrasse. The school there was full of people, hundreds of them. Some were injured. Others were suffering from burns. Every classroom was full. Hardly anyone had more than the clothes they were wearing. Only one or two had managed to pack a suitcase. I looked out of the window and saw that Eastern Hamburg was burning from end to end. Wherever you looked, all you could see were flames.
The hot wind in those summer days fanned the mix of aerial mines, high-explosive bombs, phosphorus and other incendiary bombs even more. A firestorm swept through the streets. Günther rested in the school building in the Norderstrasse, but not for long. He wanted to continue looking for his brother.
In the early morning, making my way through rubble, I went straight back to Hammerbrook. There were dead bodies everywhere. I turned over corpses that looked male to see whether it was Hermann lying there. After I had checked a few bodies, an army officer appeared and said, "By rights I ought to shoot you, because you are robbing the dead." I was in tears and said, "So do it then. I have just about had enough. I'm looking for my brother." He relaxed and said that was okay. But he wanted me to help remove the corpses. I can't do that, I told him, and ran away.
Günther continued his search for his brother and for somewhere to sleep in the nights ahead. Hardly anything was left of Hammerbrook. Rudjaks had escaped the threat of deportation. Her traumatic experience at the collecting point had terrified her. What if she wasn't so lucky the next time? Ellie, Ruth and Esther needed a plan.
As we left the Große Hamburger Straße, we ran into my aunt, my mother's youngest sister. The children can't come to the Pappelallee anymore, she said. That's now out of the question. She and my mother then discussed what to do with us. My aunt had an idea. Herr Lindenberg had always said that if my mother were in difficulties, she should turn to him. So Mummy went to see Herr Lindenberg, and he told her we could move into the summer house. He was going to be called up, and the place would be empty anyway. So we moved into Herr Lindenberg's summer house.
The hut and the allotment colony outside the city centre gave the Yaks hope and fresh courage. The family's friend, Leo Lindenberg, did not hesitate to help the three in their need.
He was a typical German civil servant, incredibly small-minded, but he had a big heart and was very religious, a devout Christian. I must say that he fell in love with my mother the very first time he set eyes on her. I can't imagine any other reason why a man would take in two Jewish children. From the moment our parents separated, he probably sensed that he stood a chance.
Moving into the allotment was absolutely essential. But even so, 14-year-old Ruth found it hard to give up her home.
I had always been used to living in large, well-lit rooms, but the biggest room in the summer house was 2 meters square and packed with junk. When the temperature dropped below freezing, our water supply froze. We had a pit toilet, which meant fetching water from the pump. It was a tough time.
The summer house was a particularly good place to hide from the Nazis. The Yaks didn't have to worry about anyone informing on them. No one in the neighborhood asked any questions. Ellie Yaks had worked out a credible story for herself and her daughters.
We told neighbors we'd been bombed out like lots of people in Berlin, and that Herr Lindenberg had offered us his summer house. It was all official, we said, and everyone accepted that.
To maintain their cover, the Yaks had to keep convincing people that they were Aryans loyal to the regime. The civil servant status of their landlord proved particularly helpful.
Herr Lindenberg was a party member. His sole job was to collect money for winter relief, and I had to take it over. With my tin in my hand, once a month, I rang the doorbells of people in the allotment colony and asked for a donation. Sometimes I'd be sent packing. "Clear off, you Nazi brat. You'll not get a penny from us." That was the best thing that could have happened to me. I was accepted as a Nazi brat, and that was fine with me right through to 1945.
The Harmony allotment colony in Berlin-Wittenau provided protection for Ellie Yaks and especially for her persecuted daughters. But Ruth was missing her freedom. One summer's day in 1943, she could no longer stand it in the cramped hut.
It was extremely hot in Herr Lindenberg's summer house. I told my mother I was going bathing in Lübars. She warned me to be careful. When I was lying there, a boy asked me if I'd like to play dodgeball. And I thought, why not? The lifeguard, Herr Schwedhelm, told me that they needed someone to join their youth group. So I did. And no one asked any questions. "My name is Ruth," I said. After all, it's not a name that would raise eyebrows.
Ruth Yaks was outside again, enjoying life with friends once more. She learned how to swim, and that summer managed for a few hours a day to forget the war and the threat of deportation, until reality caught up with her again.
Word went out that we were all to be given reports, but that meant showing a membership card of the League of German Girls. And I didn't have one, of course. So I came up with 1,000 excuses. One day, Frau Schwedhelm took me to one side. "I need to take the dog for a walk," she said. "I'd like you to join me, because there's something I have to talk to you about." I suspected what might be in store. Well, after much humming and hawing, I came clean and said that I was half Jewish, that I should actually be wearing the Star of David, that I was living semi-clandestinely, and that I had no identity card. "You'll get your report without a card," she said, "and we'll pretend that this conversation never took place." And that's what happened. I have to express my gratitude to the Schwedhelms. Through them, I was able to enjoy a few carefree hours.
After the air raids of Operation Gomorrah, Günter Lux had to fend for himself in Hamburg. The firestorm had burnt itself out, but any buildings still standing were gutted. The east of Hamburg lay in ruins.
The other nights I just dossed down somewhere, at the main station, because the subway was no longer in use, or in ruined buildings. I went to the Moorweide, where food was being doled out to people who were now homeless. They had butter churns, bread and sugar, and I got a crust of bread and some sugar. But that didn't last. Go to the university, I was told. You'll also get some travel documents. So I did. I told them my parents were in the protectorate, so they gave me a travel pass to go there.
Günter Lux set out for what is today the Czech Republic. It was a long train journey that took him through Dresden, Prague and Brno. In Tischnowitz, 14-year-old Günter asked if the name Krušák was familiar to anyone. And his luck was in. In the end, totally exhausted, he arrived at the house where his stepfather and his mother lived.
She looked at me and took me in her arms. "Günter, my son," she cried. But then she immediately asked me about Hermann. All I could tell her was that he was missing.
Elisabeth Krušák was beside herself. She set out for Hamburg to look for her eldest son, but she drew a blank. Hermann was nowhere to be found. In despair, his mother returned to the protectorate. After his grim experiences in Hamburg, Günter remained with his family in the present-day Czech Republic. In the summer of 1944, Helmut Krušák's job there was done, so the family all returned to Hamburg.
The whole family lived in the cellar of a ruined building in Horn. My mother was heavily pregnant, and in August 1944, little Helmut was born. It was then just too cramped in the two-room cellar, with 3 children and 2 adults, and me always in between.
Günter could not abandon the hope of seeing his brother Hermann again. He had been hoping for months for some sign of life, but there was nothing.
My stepfather told me it was pointless. "Stop searching," he said. "He's dead." After that, even my mother gave up. And besides, what could you do? They built a wall around Hammerbrook and Rothenburgsort and declared the districts a no-go area because of the risk of an epidemic. And if you went to see the authorities, you just got turned away. So in time, you simply resign yourself to the situation. But I always felt like an alien in the family. It was so cramped where we lived. I had just a small corner in the ruins. Some toys, books, and magazines from the post office.
Just as the Hitler Youth freely declared its loyalty to the Führer and the Reich when war broke out, today it has become a movement of volunteers for military service. In a rally at a historic site, a report was given to the Führer on volunteers born in the year 1928. The East Prussia region herewith registers 9,482 volunteers from the Hitler Youth for military service.
Then came an order affecting the Home Guard. All men between the ages of 16 and 60 were to be called up and had to register. That, I thought, is a chance to get out of this cellar. And besides, according to the newsreels, the Bolsheviks were committing atrocities in East Prussia, murdering people and children. This had such an effect on me that I said I'd help to prevent that if I could. My mother reckoned that was senseless. Forget it, she said. Stay here. But my stepfather said, let him go. The war's nearly over anyway. He won't be sent to the front. He'll do training and then come back. I had the feeling that he was thinking about one less mouth to feed, which I suppose was somehow understandable.
In the winter of 1944, the people of Berlin tried to save the last belongings they had left. By now, the war had destroyed almost everything. For 2 years, Ruth Jax had heard nothing from her father, Hermann. All she knew was that in February 1943, he had been deported to Monowitz. With the Star of David on her jacket, every trip to the city centre was fraught with danger for the 16-year-old, but she also met people who were kind to her.
I was coming from my aunt's and had to cross the Alte Schönhauser Straße. The tar on the road was on fire, but I had to get through. People soaked woolen blankets in water and wrapped them around us. First, we also had to soak our shoes. At the end of the street, the blankets had to be handed back. They still gave me a woolen blanket, even though I was wearing a star on my jacket.
Just before Christmas, Ruth had to fear for her life once again.
Factory searches were being carried out and arrests made in a final roundup, if you like. I had heard of these operations, and when I mentioned them to a colleague, he said I should go and see my doctor. Maybe he could help. He asked me whether I still had my appendix. Yes, I told him. So I went to the doctor's and he said I should eat some undercooked potatoes. I had no idea where I could get hold of potatoes, but the doctor gave me some. Just cut them in half, he said, and when they're only half done, swallow them and wait a few hours. Your appendix will automatically become inflamed. And don't take too much care over personal hygiene. So I did all that, and he sent me to hospital. My doctor came to see me every 2 days. The search operations were still being carried out, so each time he opened up my wound again so that I could stay in hospital a few days longer. As a result, I avoided detection.
But the danger was by no means over. Fear and terror continued to rule in Germany. Hitler's victims longed to be liberated by the Allies. They were inquisitive, trusting, and still malleable in their development. In the Third Reich, the National Socialists shamelessly exploited the naivety of the children.
Teachers told me that the Führer wanted the best for Germany.
Youngsters were manipulated. Human values no longer counted.
Suddenly, the call came to hate, to demand separation.
Nothing was the way it once was.
Never again do I want to experience the pain of saying goodbye to someone you know will be taken away the next day.
The horror was inconceivable.
What children experienced in those camps can never be wiped from their memories.
Children in the midst of falling bombs. In World War II, daily life had become a nightmare.
Bombs were exploding all the time.
The grown-ups clung to us and we hung on to them because everyone was terrified.
A childhood spent in chaos.
All they knew was that they had to function in this tiny segment, and they did function like clockwork.
Exploited for Hitler's insane plans, the Nazis sent child soldiers into battle.
Günther, there's one over there. Get him out.
These children would never forget what they had seen at the front.
No one with any common sense would have thought this possible.
What was vaunted as heroism gave way to bloody reality.
I was paralyzed with fear. What if he pulls the trigger, I thought.
What they had experienced not only haunted soldiers, even after the war.
And then we were beaten. It was appalling.
The collapse became traumatic. Many soldiers would never forget the horror.
What did you do with the child? My God, what on earth happened to you out there?
For someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, the trauma is never over.
The evil Nazi regime had exploited and betrayed them. What has remained is the pain.
Naturally, it's incredibly hard for many of them to understand that it was all an illusion, to realize that they were lied to.
We're talking about the eternal child that cried out so loudly but was never heard because there was no time or place for that.
For the gruesome war of the adults, the youngest of all sacrificed their most precious possession.
When I had overcome my disgust, I turned over the first corpse. Doing something like that is totally alien to childhood.
In the war, you just weren't a child anymore.
The war has entered its final months. On the Western Front, the Allies are advancing on Germany kilometre by kilometre. In the East, too, Soviet forces are pushing Hitler's troops further and further back. The world has been at war for more than 5 years. Yet losses in the last 12 months of the conflict will be higher than ever before. But the Nazis decree there will be no surrender. In winter 1944, Günter Lux was 16 years old. Despite his communist upbringing, the Nazis had managed to get him on their side. The bombing raids launched under Operation Gomorrah had cost the life of his big brother Hermann. Now Günter felt alone. He didn't feel at home with his mother, his stepfather, and his 3 half-sisters. He saw the Home Guard as the chance to get out of his cellar in the ruins of Hamburg. So he signed up as a war volunteer and was sent to a training camp in what is today the Czech Republic.
The training was brutal. We had to crawl through the snow on our stomachs and appear the next day in clean uniforms. Lord knows how we got them dry. No one helped us. We were also bullied when we cleaned our weapons. The sergeant would turn up and say, "This is filthy. There's dirt here too. Clean it again." And he'd do that 5 times. After the 5th complaint, I did nothing. Then, when I showed him my weapon, he'd say, "Now, why didn't I get that the first time?" So it was pure bullying. We had to jump on and off tanks and fetch anti-tank grenades. We had to dig foxholes left and right as wide as tanks' tracks. We then had to crouch in them, and a tank would thunder over us. When its track lifted up behind us, We'd get showered with dirt. It was horrible. I deliberately behaved as if I was retarded. So, in the end, they said I was too stupid for an anti-tank unit and transferred me to the infantry.
The boys were supposed to begin home leave before being sent to the front, but on a day in March, it all turned out differently.
A group leader came to us and said, "The Führer needs you now. Germany is in great danger. So we're all going to be transferred voluntarily to the SS." Voluntarily, we thought, how come voluntarily? We'd never once been asked. But then he said, "Any objections? Has anyone got anything to say?" But none of us dared open his mouth. In the evening, when we were all in bed, two of our group started crying. They wanted to go home.
But now there was no way back. Children were taught how to handle a weapon and then sent to kill in a merciless conflict. Most of them knew how dangerous it would be, yet still they volunteered.
Looking at the situation with sheer common sense, you could wonder how that was ever possible. One answer could be that identification with the culprits created an illusion of power vis-à-vis the feeling of total impotence.
Dr. Andreas Krüger is a child and adolescent therapist in Hamburg. In researching the origins of such traumas, he is helping to gain an understanding of why children behave the way they did.
As a dream therapist, I have found time and again that the core experience is one of powerlessness, and it is this that has to be combated on all levels, on a personal or human relationship level, or on a neurobiological level. Either I resign myself to my guilt and become the sacrificial lamb, or I go on to the attack and identify with those who are responsible for my powerlessness.
The Nazis shamelessly exploited this behavior. Children were beguiled with the myth of military heroism and sent into a hopeless struggle. Some of the experienced soldiers were appalled.
Captain Hafner was supposed to recapture an area that had already been occupied by the Russians. He had asked the SS for reinforcements, and they had sent us. "What am I supposed to do with these kids?" Hafner said. "They're much too small. Look at him there. He's not much bigger than his rifle. And his sleeves are far too long. What use is this lot?" "Well, that's all there is," he was told.
And so, in their oversized uniforms, the boys were dispatched into a life-or-death struggle. In April 1945, in many German cities, the war was already over, but that made no difference to those in power. Soldiers had to continue defending what had long been lost.
We finally took up position in Lower Austria on the Czech border. We had been there for quite a while when I was told that I was going to be trained as a sniper. At first, I couldn't shoot at all. I nearly knocked my teeth out with the recoil, but I gradually became a good shoot. One day, I was lying next to a section commander just outside our position. He was looking through his binoculars and said, "Günther, there's one back there. Get rid of him." So I calmly took aim and fired. The man threw his arms in the air and fell. I did that several times, 6 or 7 times. 2 hits were confirmed officially. I felt really guilty, but I had to do what I had been ordered.
Günther Lux was still a minor, but he had already killed. He would never have thought things would get that far. In Berlin, too, winter was over. Ever since the Nazis had deported her father 2 years previously, Ruth Jax and her little sister Esther had been living with their mother in the summer house. For months, it had been bitterly cold, but the summer house had no heating.
When my sister turned 8 on March the 1st, 1945, she was already very poorly. She had septic diphtheria. My mother called a doctor, and he said at once that she needed hospital treatment, but that there was no way any transport could be organized. So despite her high temperature, she would have to walk there. My mother took her, and on March the 4th, my sister died. On the 8th, we buried her in Weißensee. The inscription on her gravestone is so pertinent. What we hold in coffins belongs to the time. What we love remains and will remain for all eternity.
Bleibt in Ewigkeit.
Four weeks later, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of the capital. The battle for Berlin had begun. Monika Jette was 5 at the time and was living in the capital with her mother and elder sister. Her father, Werner, was still serving at the front, but the family had no idea exactly where. In Berlin, the last resistance offered by the Germans was in vain.
We were in the cellar, where we were always told to be very quiet. And then someone said, "The Russians are here." I clearly remember how the bolt to our air raid shelter was pushed back, and I saw the Russians standing there with their fur caps. We'd been told how terrible the Russians were, but they were really nice to us children, I must say. They made liver sausage sandwiches for us and gave us lots of other things they had. It was only later that I heard of what they did to the women. Sadly, one of them was my own mother.
In the Third Reich, the Allies were capturing one town after another. The Second World War was almost over. Countless German Wehrmacht soldiers were taken prisoner by the Allies. To avoid capture, many of the young men deserted. But in the east in particular, partisans lay in wait for them. In April 1945, Günter Lux was still with his unit.
Out of 200 men in the company, there were only 56 of us left, and we had to hold our ground in foxholes 10 meters apart. Now and then, the Russians would mount an operation to capture one of us. They needed information. They'd pull a man out of his foxhole. But if he shouted, he would be shot.
Any hope of holding the position for some time was pointless. Soviet troops would soon take the area. May the 2nd, 1945. Günter Lux was hoping that he'd soon be able to go home.
Armored infantryman Lux, I was told, I want you to collect all the ammunition that's lying around here. Tomorrow, you'll be relieved. I was given a sack and then left the command bunker. Then I heard the familiar whine of shells. I knew the difference between multiple rockets and mortars. Mortars made a kind of fluttering noise. The explosion wasn't so loud, but fragments were hurled up. And it was this fluttering that I heard. Just as I had been taught, I threw myself down, one arm in front of me, and my rifle on my left. But I was too late. The shell exploded 3 meters away from me. My chest hurt. So did my face. Something was wrong. Then a comrade came, took my rifle, and pulled me to my feet. The Russians saw this and opened fire. I got hit in the backside. It was only a grazing shot, but it gave me a large, bloody wound. Our rocket launcher unit was nearby, and they dragged me over to them and laid me on a tank. I was then taken to the field station 3 kilometers away to be patched up.
The war was in its final days. The fighting on both sides was marked by an almost inconceivable brutality. Only a few of the wounded managed to make it to a first aid post. What is more, often even the field hospitals were directly in the line of fire of the opposing forces. Günter Lux made it. On arrival at the field hospital, his fight for survival continued.
I had surgery on May the 3rd. They told me that the doctor wanted to have a quiet word with me since I was scared about going under the knife. But what he said was, you don't have to worry about your family anymore. Earlier today, Hamburg was occupied without offering any resistance. And there I was, stuck on that wretched operating table. He then slipped a mask over my face, dripped ether onto it, and told me to breathe deeply. It was awful. It made me want to gag. Don't gag, he said. Breathe and count. I got to about 5 and was gone. When I awoke, I found myself in a barn, surrounded by wailing wounded. When I was lying there in all my misery, the medical orderly came over and told me he couldn't help me. I was in a lot of pain, but only the seriously wounded were given painkillers. I didn't get anything.
Now at last he could go home. Together with other wounded soldiers, Günter Lux boarded a train.
The hospital train set off on the 3rd or 4th of May and crossed the border. We saw a sign saying Linz. Linz is in Austria, and in those days it was part of the Reich. Suddenly, the train stopped, and someone said that Linz had been occupied by the Americans. Instead of waiting or going there, the officer in charge said, "We're not going to let ourselves be captured. We're heading back." So the train had to return to the Protectorate. It came to a final standstill on a siding outside Písek. The next morning, I heard cheering. I listened to the radio in Písek because I could understand a little Czech and heard the words capitulation and victory. And that was on the 8th of May. We were sitting in the train and the war was over.
In Berlin, the Soviets were taking the capital street by street. In their allotment hideout in the Berlin suburb of Wittenau, Ruth Jax and her mother were longing for the fighting to stop.
When we heard the shooting and the sound of rockets, we knew that we wouldn't have much longer to wait.
They didn't. Hitler was now dead, and German resistance had collapsed. The capital was in Soviet hands. For Ruth Jax, the fear and all the hoping in their hideout were over.
On May the 1st, I walked from Wittenau to Weißensee for the first time to see whether the other relatives were there.
The sisters and her mother's brother were still alive, but there was no trace of their Jewish relatives. The German armed forces capitulated. The Second World War was over. The propaganda about a 1,000-year Reich and the promises German youth would prove heroic were all lies. Everything children had believed in was now worthless.
Na, das ist ein tiefer Schock. Also das ist auch was viele Jugendliche.
It was a huge shock, something many youngsters just could not believe. At the same time, however, many realized it was true as they made their way through a Germany in ruins. What they saw helped them to understand what had happened, but many others, of course, found it incredibly hard to comprehend that it had all been an illusion, that they had been deceived. There is no doubt that at some time or other, many succeeded in taking the step towards renouncing everything they had been told. But that meant gaining a new angle on their own lives and on what had been important beforehand, before they had to grow up too soon. Now, another massive step towards maturity was required to say, I need to take a different view. I was duped by a regime. But that, I believe, is a maturity which only comes during the course of a lifetime.
Many soldiers were massively disillusioned, but just as many at least were relieved that the horrors of war, the killing and the dying were now over. Günter Lux experienced the end of the war in what is now the Czech Republic. There, the wounded soldiers waited to see what would happen next.
We were lying in the hospital train. The first to arrive were Soviet soldiers. Some were tipsy from drinking vodka. They wanted to have our watches. One day, another soldier turned up and began shouting and firing like mad in the air. He then stormed into the carriage right next to where I lay and fired twice through the window. Then he put the barrel of his gun against my head. It was still hot at the front, and he started talking to me. I didn't understand a word. I had no idea what he wanted. And besides, I was paralyzed with fear. I just kept thinking, if he pulls the trigger, which was only to be expected. But he was suddenly distracted and left. My goodness, was I scared. It had been a long time since I felt that I was going to die.
The hospital train had stopped on the demarcation line in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. It was here that Soviet troops from the east met American forces advancing from the west. They were to decide together what should be done with the prisoners.
This American officer came up and said that only the most seriously wounded could stay on the train. Those who were only slightly wounded would all have to get off. The doctor protested in my case, but to no avail. As the train pulled away, we looked on wistfully. I thought of how I could have been in it on my way home. But I owe my life to the circumstances which had taken me off it. Any soldier who had been with the SS, no matter how old he was immediately shot by the border police or partisans, as they called themselves. If I had been on board, they would have shot me too.
Those who had been left behind still had no idea what fate awaited them. At home in Berlin, together with her mother and her sister, Monika Jetter feared for the life of her father, Werner. They had still heard nothing from him, so they had no idea that he too had been taken prisoner.
He and 3 other soldiers had been captured by an American. Asked if they were Nazis, the others said they weren't. They were all led into a barn. My father then admitted to having been a National Socialist and was taken to one side. He thought he was going to be shot and the others spared. But the soldier then came back and said, "You told the truth, right or wrong, my country." And that is how he survived, he told us. He then became an American prisoner of war.
He remained a prisoner for weeks and months that followed. He had no contact with his family. At home, they assumed he was missing. But just like in wartime, even after the war, at first, fear and grief were secondary. There was much to be done.
The slogan at the end of the war was, "Life must go on." You had to make sure there was food on the table. Thank God we had a big garden, which provided us with fruit and vegetables.
Children learned to come to terms with the situation. With the bombing now over, the ruins became playgrounds.
We played cops and robbers in the ruins. The boys stole non-ferrous metal. I have such incredible memories of it all. Children lived their own lives, probably in order to survive. Everyone was in some gang or other, which roamed through the ruins. I remember this one apartment which had been boarded up. We went in and found this skeleton. We were petrified and went and told the man who dealt in non-ferrous metals. "Oh, that's just a Jew they forgot," he said. And we thought, "Who is Mr. Jew? Where is he?"
Then the waiting was over. In 1946, the father and husband who had been missing for so long returned home to Berlin, to a new world Werner was not prepared for.
When my father came home, that part of Berlin where I grew up was already under American administration. To make ends meet, amongst other things, my mother washed uniforms for the Americans. As far as I know, we hadn't been told of his impending arrival. So suddenly, one day, he was there. And the first thing he saw, of course, was the American uniforms hanging ironed in the hall. The enemy's uniforms. "That has to stop," he said. Then, as a father and head of the family, he tried to ensure that we had food on the table. And he did that very well. Above all, he said, "You're going to learn something. You're going to attend good schools." Classrooms back then were all overcrowded with 40 to 50 children in one class, but he saw to it that we went to a convent school. That meant paying school fees and finding money for books and fares, but he came up with it. "We can't give you much," he said, "but we can give you a good education so that you can make something better of your lives."
Werner made sure there was money for food and school fees, but no emotional bond developed within the family. Father and daughter were strangers.
For many children born during the war, their father was first of all a stranger entering the apartment. He was a man coming back into a family which had no chance of starting at square one again. Each family member had his or her own character with their own experiences. Starting afresh just wasn't on. There were lots of family constellations which did not correspond to the mother-father-child principle. The desire might have been there to live as an intact family, but the structures were simply different. Breaches arose between parents and children, which cannot be imagined dramatically enough.
To work through what he had experienced as a soldier, Monica's father brought the war back into everyday life. He turned the house into a barracks.
Everything had to be clean and in order and done snappily. I never saw my father with dirty fingernails or sloppily dressed. He thought a lot of himself. In fact, it was this role model approach he'd been taught at the Ordensburg. I had to pass lots of tests of courage as a child. I had to jump down from sand piles, do squats and press-ups, and walk like a duck. All the things he had had to do. He did them all with me, but basically just to break my spirit. "A German child doesn't do that," he'd say. "A German child doesn't do that," but he never managed to break me. A child has only two possibilities in a situation like that: to commit or become a rebel. And I became a rebel.
Werner Jetter provided for his family, but closeness to his daughter was not a priority, and he didn't stop at bullying and a rigorously strict upbringing.
In addition to this military stiffness came grand virtues like never lie. If you tell a lie once, no one will believe you again. And never allow a lie to desecrate your mouth. Lots of military stuff like that. One day he was dealing on the black market. He'd brought a suitcase with him that was full of Hershey chocolate. I'll never forget those little bars of chocolate. The suitcase looked so inviting, so I took one bar and thought no one would notice. After all, there were so many chocolate bars there. And then I took another one. As naive as I was, I crumpled up the wrapper and threw it out of the window. He then came and asked me if I had taken it. No, I said. He stared at me and asked me again, did you take it? No. So what is this then? What followed was a good hiding. He had this piece of wood with strips of leather attached. I've no idea where he got it from, and he thrashed me with it. Afterwards, I crept under the bed like a little animal. I remember my mother coming and saying, "What did you do to the child? My goodness, whatever happened to you out there?" After that, she completely cut herself off from my father. And ever since then, I have felt nothing for him. That was just too much.
It was the start of a nightmare. But it was the only time that Monica's mother experienced what her husband was capable of doing to his child.
I only ever experienced things like that when my mother wasn't there. She had a job in a hospital. I'm certain that had she been present, she would have intervened. But I never said anything. There was just that one time when he used that cat-o'-nine-tails on me, and she took him to task for it. But she couldn't have known about all the other times because I never said anything. I was far too frightened by the thought of what it might trigger off.
Monica soon came to envy those friends whose fathers had fallen in the war. Hers was not the father she had longed for.
The feeling then arose within the family that it would have been better if he had stayed away, not because he had become a bad person, but because he had had no chance to handle his wartime experiences without professional support. We have to assume that a child that experienced its father as a returnee, especially a late returnee, would be totally traumatized. And in this case, the father was even suffering from a post-traumatic stress disorder. In that situation, none of the family was able to regulate his or her stress, and the father flipped out.
In a provisional American prisoner of war camp, 16-year-old Günter Lux was waiting for his next orders. Finally, the march began, and he was heading east. The German soldiers from the field hospital were to become Soviet prisoners of war.
One day we had to march to Tabor, where there was a huge reception camp for 25,000 German soldiers. On arrival, we were met by a German officer in full uniform but unarmed, sitting next to a Soviet guard. What's going on, I wondered. This lieutenant came over and told us new arrivals that superiors had to be saluted. The war might be over, he said, but we are still the German Wehrmacht, even if we are prisoners. I thought he'd lost his marbles. But we didn't dare say anything. Just look at the state of you, he said. Each of you should at least wear an epaulette. We had all removed our epaulets, but we got them sewn back on our uniforms.
As a member of the Waffen-SS, on completion of his training, Günther had had his blood group tattooed on his upper left arm, a distinctive mark which branded him forever.
One day, the order came through that all adolescents up to the age of 16 were to be released. We all lined up, but only to hear that this order did not include members of the SS. We were told to strip to the waist and raise our arms as the officer went past. When the row in front of me had been checked, someone in front of me said, "I've already been checked, so come and swap places with me." But I didn't dare. I had no idea who might be watching. So in my misery, I just stood there. Then the officer came and said, "SS, step out."
Günter Lux remained a prisoner of war. Months passed. Back home in Hamburg, his family had no idea where he was. In April 1947, Elisabeth Kuschak received a postcard. The sender was allowed just 25 words, but it was a first sign of life. "Dear Mum, belated congratulations on your birthday. Spring has arrived here too. Lots of love from your dear son, Günter." Later, longer letters were permitted. Günter dreamt of being released and allowed to go home at last. But it would be a long time before that happened. When the war came to an end, finally so did life in their hideout for Ruth Jax and her mother. Their time spent in the cold, cramped summer house was over.
We were allocated an apartment by someone who was a party member. I myself spent only a year in it, my mother 9 months. And then Herr Lindenberg made accommodation available on his plot in Tegel, and we moved in because I didn't feel at home in someone else's house. But that had been only temporary anyway. We just needed a roof over our heads, a place with heating, where we could use a bathtub or take a shower.
The ruined streets of Berlin were soon full of life again as people built new lives for themselves. Ruth Jax also had plans for the future.
I'd only had 4.5 years primary school in my life. In 1945, I wanted to go back to school, but I wasn't allowed to. Since I was already 16, they said I no longer had any claim to schooling. I was shattered.
But Ruth didn't let her disappointment get the better of her. That same summer in 1945, she started an apprenticeship as a seamstress. But for 3 years she had been tormented by the question of where her father was, indeed whether he was still alive. Would she ever see him again? Ruth soon received an answer.
My cousin Willi, the brother of Egon, who was the first to be murdered, was the only relative to return from Auschwitz. One day he came into my uncle's shop in Weißensee. He saw me first and said hello. My uncle heard his voice and knew at once who it was. "Is that really you, Willi?" he said. We were absolutely delighted to see anyone at all. He then told us that my father had been murdered. But because he had been something of a nutcase, even as a child, I didn't believe him. My mother then told me not to be silly. "You can believe him," she said. "No, I can't," I replied. "You can say what you want, but my daddy is still alive. And he is still alive in me today."
It was true. Hermann Jax had been murdered by the Nazis. After spending 2 years in various prisoner of war camps, in 1947, Günter Lux was transferred to the Soviet capital.
I was then sent to Moscow. Tushino was something of a model camp. The conditions were fairly good. We were even able to do some acting. The director came to me and said, "You're a good-looking chap. Can you sing?" He wanted to put on an operetta. "Then you can play the woman," he said. "You could pass for one." I was asked to sing something for him, and he thought it was pretty good. They kitted me out as a woman, with a wig and everything. When I sang the part, I got tremendous applause. But I didn't do it anymore after that. I was given a bodyguard because the prisoners were suffering from a lack of female company. I had to save my skin on a few occasions. I was also given a sleeping cabin behind the stage, because in their desperation, the men thought I was a woman.
Once again, Günther's membership of the SS prevented him from returning home.
Obviously, we all wanted to go home. I had been on the returnees list twice already, but had to get off the train again before it set off. An officer appeared, looked at the list and said, "Looks, Günther, German, SS, out." So I had to go back and work. I swore that wouldn't happen to me again. It was just too hard to take. In my thoughts, I was already back home. And then that.
Hope of ever being back in Hamburg with his family dwindled. 19-year-old Günther remained in the camp and had to continue rebuilding Moscow. In summer 1949, he was working on a construction site in Moscow.
Next to the construction site were some houses that had been completed. People were already living in them. One day I saw a girl looking out of the window. She was really pretty, and I hadn't seen a woman for a long time. You could give her a wave, I thought, and so I did. When she gave me a quick wave back, I thought, that's a start. Now you have to continue. I worked there every day, always in the hope of seeing her standing there again.
The girl was called Valja. Next to the fence enclosing the prisoners, she tended an overgrown garden.
One day I went over. She was standing there, weeding her radishes. "Nice plants," I said, but I really couldn't have cared less. "May I touch your hands?" I asked. She then came over to the wire mesh fence and pressed her hands against it. I did the same from my side. It was such a wonderful feeling, one I had not had for such a long time. "Well, that's enough for now," she said, and left.
Günther often met Valja by the fence. Soon they wanted to be closer. Günther had befriended one of the Soviet guards and asked him for advice. Yorka managed to smuggle him out of the building site, enabling Günther to meet Valja in her parents' summer house.
2 hours, he told me, and then you have to return. I went into the summer house with her, and we had a nice chat, as it were. She made me swear not to tell anyone what happened between us, and I intend to keep that promise even today.
Günther fell in love with the 16-year-old. At last, he had known happiness. He was even prepared to give up his homeland for Valja.
I told the camp commandant that I wanted to stay in the Soviet Union. "I have met a girl," I said, "and I want to marry her." When you are together with a girl and you promise marriage, then you have to keep your word. At first, he was sympathetic, but then he said, "That's out of the question. You are a fascist, and she is a Bolshevik girl. We could never tolerate that." The next day, I was transferred to another work unit and never saw her again.
Und sah sie nie wieder.
Their love never stood a chance. Only a few months later, Günther was suddenly allowed to return home.
Und dann kam eines Tages,
One day, it was Christmas Eve, we had to assemble by the gate. Then, for the last time, the officer said, "Lux, Günther, German, get on board." And then I was off home.
Und dann ging es nach Hause.
Together with his friend Edgar, Günther Lux travelled back home to his native Hamburg.
When we pulled into the station, everything was so familiar. There were crowds of people. They showed us pictures. Do you know him? Does anyone know him? Then I heard someone shout out, "Günther!" It was my mother. She ran up to me and said, "I'm so glad you're so big. And you were so small when you left." Then we went home.
In Berlin, Monika Jetter had suffered from her father's constant rages ever since his return 6 years previously. He bullied the child and even beat her. Her daily nightmare only came to an end after she turned 11, because then, as a travelling salesman, her father was rarely at home. As a child, her father's behaviour was incomprehensible, but today Monika can explain it.
Basically, when he returned from the war, my father was severely traumatized. My situation, I think, was no different from that of many other children, that as a father he was emotionally unreachable. Naturally, like every soldier who sadly had to serve in the war, what he had experienced had brutalized him. And in addition to this psychological aspect, which had thoroughly demoralized him, there was this all-for-nothing element. He had imagined his life quite differently. If I had been a Junker, we would have had horses, he'd say. You'd have been able to ride, and we would have had a fabulous life. This is what he imagined for us.
But even an explanation cannot alleviate the pain. Monika Jetter can understand her father, but she cannot forgive him.
But the terrible thing about this story is the tremendous disappointment you carry inside you, especially as a girl. Her father is the first man in a girl's life, so you want to love him, and you want him to love you. If you don't get that, you have a deficit your whole life long. Later, when you have a partner, you hope that this partner will make up for this deficit. That there you will find warmth and the acceptance that you will be loved solely for who you are, that you don't have to make an effort or pass some test of courage in order to be loved.
When she was barely 17, Monika moved out of her parents' home. She felt homesick, but only for her beloved mother. When she passed away in 1996, Monika could no longer avoid contact with her father.
When he was dying, I cared for him until he drew his last breath. On his deathbed, his hand reached out for mine. "Don't you love me just a little bit?" he asked. I was stunned. I felt nothing. But I quickly said, "Yes, I do." That's enough when you're close to death, I thought. But for life, it would not have been enough. I found it really hard to handle the fact that he had got me to make a confession of love. I couldn't really grieve when he died, because inside I was simply dead along with him.
For many years, Ruth Jacks consciously avoided the darkest chapter in her life. She got married and wanted only to look to the future. She suppressed the pain.
Whenever I thought about that time, I used to break down in tears and start shaking. It was absolutely awful. I hardly ever spoke about it.
Her cousin Willi returned from Auschwitz. He was the only one. Ruth never saw any of her Jewish relatives again. For a long time, she refused to accept the reality.
Right up until 1948, whenever I saw a man who looked like my father, I'd run up to him. Then, oh dear, it's not him. Although I knew that he had been killed, I refused to believe it. And that was how it stayed until the day in 1968, when I sailed to Israel. And the ship's barman said to me, "I know you, even though we've never met before. Your father was called Hermann, and he and I were together in Morowitz."
Dein Vater hieß Hermann.
He took me under his wing as his son and looked after me as long as he was alive. Because you have the same looks and, above all, the same movements and gestures as your father, I knew at once who you were.
Die Gesten deines Vaters in dir trägst, habe ich sofortig erkannt.
It was only then, 23 years after the end of the war, that Ruth could start opening herself up to the reality of her father's death and come to terms with the loss. Life has to go on, and the past will not be discussed. That was the basic principle in many German households after the end of the war. But the pain, the guilt, and the suffering remained. Feelings that had been overwhelmingly present for so long were buried deep in the soul. Never again should they surface.
In my opinion, with the whole generation traumatized, you can't say to someone, "Tell me, was it that terrible?" It is actually a natural impulse to say, "Open up, let me know how you feel." And it is what that person who was asked would normally like to do. But he tried it once and got these flashbacks. So henceforth he will avoid the issue like a horse shies away from fire, even though he would like nothing more than to describe his experiences. But he can't. The mega stress this would cause, the moment he remembered, would completely shatter him. And that makes him silent, mute, and bitter.
I can only say that alcohol, the old devil, played a role. I drank a lot to blot it out. After I had been drinking, things were basically all right again. It stopped me thinking about it all.
Günther soon found happiness at last. In 1952, at a party in Hamburg-Horn, he met Doris. It was love at first sight. 3 years later, they got married.
We've been a married couple since 1955. Marriage gave me stability. Our son was born, but in the end, we had other worries.
Back then, Günther only looked to the future. He suppressed the past.
Not having to deal with their own personal loss was something many wished for, but in the long term, it became impossible. In old age, their sorrow caught them up after all, because it belonged to their inner reality and biography, and because the war made probably the biggest biographical impact that anyone could ever have experienced.
And that also held true for Günther Lux. His experiences caught up with him years later. He started to write everything down and tell classes of school children about his turbulent life.
Youngsters have to draw their own conclusions, but I believe they have a right to experience at first hand what everything was like and why everything happened the way it did. And I want to make my contribution to this.
60 years passed before Ruth Winkelmann was in a position to come to terms with the past. In 2005, she began to put her memories down on paper. The exchange with other people helped her to reflect on her experiences.
There are lots of things that emerge whenever I give a reading. That's because realizations still come to me, even today. Someone asked me what feelings November the 9th triggered off in me. I thought for a long time and said it meant the end of my childhood. That was the moment when I became an adult. No doubt about it.
Monika Jetta has also come to terms with the past. She embarked on a course of therapy and reconstructed her father's journey through life. It was an attempt at reconciliation.
I had these pounding headaches. Something needed to be got out. But I don't have that anymore. I sometimes have nightmares, but not as bad as in the past. And I have also made peace with my parents. In that respect, there is no bogeyman haunting me anymore. In the past, whenever I visited my mother's grave, he was there too. They were buried together. But I did not want to visit him. Today, though, I can go there and visit both of them. And in some way there is solace in that. I no longer go there with a heavy heart. I visit them both. And that's fine.
A childhood spent in wartime does not end with a peace treaty. Their experiences shape children forever. The memories remain an entire lifetime. The suppressed images, the unspoken words, are there no matter how deep they are buried. The scars on their childhood soul might fade one day, but the pain remains.